Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is Aaron, and I've managed to get myself sick while traveling, so I'm going to make this super quick before I start coughing. We have a great topic and guest this week. We have Reid Robinson from Zapier talking about AI integration, and that is coming up right now.
Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and today we are going to dive into something that I think a lot of you already are using in various ways, because I know as I talk to people that are working on various projects, they have a Zapier product, a project somewhere in their life, somewhere in what they're working on, whether it's a direct day-to-day job project or a sort of a side project, a side hustle or something. But today I want to kind of dive into, how Zapier is integrating AI into their product and hopefully trying to make things easier for you and easier for the projects you're working on. So very, very excited to have Reid Robinson, who is the lead AI product manager at Zapier. Reid, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brian, and hello, everybody.
Yeah. Before we dive into all the cool things that you're working on at Zapier, give us a little bit of your background, because you've got an entrepreneurial background. You've been building interesting things for a while. But tell folks a little bit about your background, and then maybe kind of blend that into what you're focused on today.
Yeah. So I got my career, I guess, in tech started as the classic way of an SDR, so sales development rep. So you're bottom of the totem pole sales rep, for anybody not familiar. And I'm like a tinkerer at heart. And so I tinkered my way up into different roles in my career, first through solutions consulting or sales architect, whatever you want to call that, over into bugging the partnerships team back at Hootsuite enough that they gave me the chance to try to make things better myself. And I got, the opportunity to get involved with product partnerships, and ultimately got the opportunity to be the first strategic alliance partner manager for Zapier, working with, our Google, all sorts of partnerships there. Ultimately left Zapier to start up my own little startup in the world of NFTs. It was done through a hackathon project with a buddy of mine from work. Knew nothing about the space, but just was interested to see what was possible. Ended up getting some users interested, investors interested, and ran it as a little side project for a while. I launched, had my first kid, sold the business, and got to rejoin Zapier working on AI stuff. So these days at Zapier, I'm kind of sitting across the organization trying to essentially help us do everything we can to advance our customers' capabilities of building cool systems with AI.
Nice. Very nice. Yeah. And that's a career path I can relate to. I think both Aaron, my co-host, and myself both sort of started in similar paths where it was, we were closer to customers for a while. We kind of did a little bit of everything in between, from technical hands-on to business development to all those sorts of things. And then at some point, like you said, you sort of have a belief that you're like, well, I think I could build this better. If I was in charge, I could, if I was making decisions, we could probably build it better. And now you are where you are. So you own it, which is great. I mentioned at the top of the show, a lot of people that we know are building projects with Zapier. Like I said, everything from automated tasks to integrations. You've recently, the company's recently started adding more and more ways to integrate AI into your platform, into your workflows. Before we dive in too much, how do you go about thinking about adding AI into a platform? I'm always curious, because AI can do a lot of things. It can mean a lot of things. But how did you guys specifically sort of think about, okay, where can this technology start to add value, for customers and users?
Yeah. So bit of history on this side. So one of the probably most fascinating things is the pitch for me to rejoin that was so compelling was two of the three Zapier co-founders were so convinced on the future of AI and the opportunity that was ahead in late 2022 that they essentially stepped down as being more people leaders of the business and wanted to be going back to being IC engineers and actually sit and experiment with what was possible. How far could you push this sort of technology? How much could it address like fundamental problems that we knew existed?
Yeah.
And we did a lot of R&D in those early days, and just testing like the biggest, like, if it could do this, it would be game changing type questions, right? So I think that's where we started at. And from there, we like spun up and sunset, I don't know, 5 or 6 different projects really rapidly.
Yeah.
And learned a lot about what was interesting, what was compelling. One of the things that came out of that was, we understood. So I would, I guess, say ground it in your customer pain points, right? For us, we knew for Zapier, a challenge is always, there's 7,000 apps on the platform. It could be a bit daunting to stare at that as a user and be like, all right, automate something.
Right.
And you're just like, all right, what? How do I put this together? What do I automate? I want to take my new leads and contact them and maybe add them to my CRM. Is that something I can do? Right. And if so, how do you actually construct that? And so that was like one of the first kind of products out of the lab side that launched was the AI's app builder, which enabled users to basically just use natural language and get the outline of a workflow that they could then go ahead and complete. From there, one of the biggest things that helped our company kind of proliferate the adoption of AI, as I would consider it, like under the hood, is probably the meat of this question, is we did a hackathon for the entire business. And unlike our usual hack weeks, for us, this one we actually did the entire company, including our non-technical staff. So if like one of the women who actually won one of our top prizes was from our comms team. And she had created these like chatbots that just really did cool things of helping draft content that would have otherwise taken their team a lot longer in a way that other people in the company could now engage with, which was really cool.
Yeah.
Especially keep in mind, this is like early 2023 when building a chatbot, was more complicated than, it's
Right.
cool to see a year later. You're like, all right, that sounds pretty simple.
Yeah. Exactly.
But out of that hack week, we actually ended up just seeing incredible ideas from the company. I think I've talked to a lot of companies, and one thing that seems to be clear is it's a bit difficult to try to figure out where does AI fit into a product roadmap? Where does it fit into a product? Does it just fit into your existing priorities, existing roadmaps? Or, I think unfortunately for some organizations, it means that you kind of got to revisit what is on your roadmap and evaluate, like, is there something more impactful we could be doing right now? And that's a very messy organizational function to do.
Right.
I often say one of the reasons I have a job is like to try to stop inertia, or like try to stop the momentum of a 800 person company.
Sure. Well,
anyway.
It's probably not unlike what a lot of the users of your platform are going through themselves, right? Like, how important should this be? Where do we reprioritize? Do we have the right people or skills in place to do this, right? Like it's one thing to see a demo. It's one thing to see a headline. It's another thing to say, like, how am I going to go live with this and figure out if it makes sense for us? So you guys are both, kind of living it internally and then externalizing it as well, which has got to be interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So through that learning journey, both, internally what you're doing and now, it's been out there for a little while, like what are you seeing as the most kind of common use cases, the most common sort of patterns and integrations, or even just the most common things that people are asking for, even if they're sort of in the abstract of people going like, wouldn't it be interesting if types of things? So what's leading, what's kind of leading the list of priorities these days in terms of what people are doing with it or what they want to do?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we first launched our, probably the early days of. Let me start by saying the way I think about AI at Zapier, it kind of falls into 3 buckets. Number 1 is quite simply under the hood usage. How do we make it easier to use the product? by leveraging AI and putting it at the right place in the right time in our users' hands. I mentioned the AI as app builder as a good example. Another one would be something we did with Formatter, which was essentially, if you want to deal with something in your workflow where you might have a user's full name, but you need to get it to a CRM that needs first name, last name, well, you need to separate that by a space, right? Likely how you're going to handle that. Annoyingly, figuring that out can be tedious. And so we made it as easy as just, if you get to that kind of mapping layer, be able to say, like, I need to separate this with a space, right? And then it'll actually automatically put in that formatter step. So that's the kind of like under the hood style thing that I like to think about. Second, and this is, anyway, probably the more meat when we think of use cases, is our users who are incorporating like LLMs into their workflows. And we first launched an OpenAI integration that supported if anybody remembers the Da Vinci model, this is prior to the chat completions and GPT-4 models that we use today. And just saw an incredible adoption. Those became, the OpenAI app, then followed by the ChatGPT app, actually became our fastest growing apps ever. Just like one after the other, which was cool to see. And users, it took us a little while, to be honest, to figure out what on earth people were doing with this. Yeah. Because it was a bit difficult I think a lot of people struggle with, like, what is just a demo? What is just, hey, this is cool? Versus a month later, 2 months later, this user, is paying for this at this point in time, right? So clearly they have value from it. And so for those use cases, we see things like content creation is actually our biggest one. So that's, write a long form Instagram post about blank topic following this format, right? It's things like that. That followed by people incorporating it into like chatbot style flows, particularly like Slack bots that they're potentially creating kind of more complex workflows from. A great example of this I like is I have one for a Slack bot that runs off my emojis that allows me to summarize a Slack thread and then condense it to a simple one line action item to put on my to-do list. Okay. And so this way, if I'm like, someone asks me to do something, I click one button and I now in my to-do list get like a summary of what that thread was about, a really neat understanding of what that action item should be called, whereas doing that in like a deterministic way is actually quite complicated.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. And that's the interesting thing is you hear different use cases for AI, specifically like you said with things tied into LLMs or OpenAI, and it feels like the spectrum of things is you have some people who are trying to think of it in terms of very big possibilities. And then, you have the ability to do, just sort of everyday day-to-day things that are going to save you a few minutes here or there, or, like your task thing. But you start to add those things up and it's like, oh, okay, I saved myself an hour a day. I saved myself 90 minutes a day or something. And you're like, oh, that's 15% of my time or whatever it might be. And all of a sudden you're like, that's powerful. So yeah, I'm curious, there's always sort of two sides of the discussion with OpenAI. And I don't mean to call them out in specific. It could be any LLM, but there's the oh wow, something here is really powerful. There's a lot of possibilities. And then it feels like sort of the other end of the spectrum is, but we get hallucinations or we get, information that's not accurate. And I don't think as a species, we've yet kind of realized like, well, what is, we're sort of so used to computing kind of either giving us something that's accurate, a table out of a database or something, or it goes, here's an error of which we don't understand what the error means, but at least it's something that distinctly says like something's not right. Like, and LLMs are sort of this new thing of like, I'm going to be very confident in giving you an answer, but you're going to have to figure out if it's accurate or not. So I'm curious, long preamble to the question. As somebody who is sitting there with the platform or with the tools that are interacting with that, like how do you go about thinking about this integration point that, like you said, could be very important to your end users, but that you don't totally have a way of controlling, or at least the output is not what we're sort of used to getting. Like, how do you even begin to think about that in terms of what your quality looks like, your reputation looks like?
Yeah, it's a fun question. And, there's the side you talked about, which like, hallucinations, that there's even just the fact that it is a non-deterministic system before you even get into hallucinations. And lastly, you get into this whole side of like the prompt injection, prompt defense, although that's sort of more nefarious side of it.
Right.
I'd say first and foremost is just some element of user education, right? Like those sorts of things are not well understood. I think the awareness of it is low at the moment.
Right.
And so I think first and foremost is just helping folks get an understanding for that. And, like we do a lot on our blog and contents and things that we linked out to, just like trying to share some of this stuff. I know even myself personally, I try to do more. But on a more concrete level, thinking about it in a workflow, that's where things like, drafts become really critical. And actually, I'll give you a real example. So when we launched that OpenAI integration and got it public, one of the use cases that started to emerge was using it as drafts for emails, right? Like you got an email, you automatically create a draft as a reply. And we actually observed really quickly that one of the issues that people were running into was that we didn't have an action for draft replies that kept it in thread. And so that was like the first action we built after we did the main OpenAI one. Mm-hmm. And since then, I think it's maintained that our users typically, and what we would typically promote is like, yeah, you want some human in the loop review step for some things. Ultimately, each business at this point in time is going to decide like what are they willing to accept from a fully automated basis versus what are they willing to accept from I need to review this basis. Yeah. Right. Like your customer, and honestly, I think the whole world is trying to come to terms with that at the moment, which is really fascinating. For me, when I talk to folks on what they're setting up, it's about informing them of really what could go wrong so that they can make the best decision on their own systems and flows and all those sorts of things. Because like we certainly have ones that do fully automated contacts, right? Or some sort of proper automation that does go. However, there's also ones that then do have a lot of human in the loop review, or ones that just go to a draft step. There's all sorts of funkiness that starts to emerge as a pattern. The last thing I'll say is just also trying to figure out like the other thing that comes with that question is like, what is the caliber of acceptable, like of good? Right. How do you evaluate that? That's also, quite honestly, it's a tricky problem. And I think most people just need to figure out like how can they get this thing as close to good as possible. And if they're feeling confident and it's good, great. If you're not, then draft state and human in the loop reviews. Highly recommended. But at this point, definitely a lot of that kind of draft review motion, pretty important. Or just make sure it's like, for instance, I have ones fully automated, but the end output is like a note to me in Evernote or a Slack DM to me, right? Where it's not having an external component, it's not having an external action capable without me getting to review that.
Right. Yeah, no, and I think I think at this point, it's like you said, a lot of it is, various levels of education, various levels of showing examples. And then, most likely, putting some things in place that sort of say, here's the things that you can do, kind of given what you might expect. Right. And people are going to have different expectation levels. People are going to have, different things that they go, that's acceptable for my business. It could be an internal thing, it could be an external thing. And I think knowing we have this weird, and again, I feel like it's just, we haven't figured out what the behavior should be because it's all so new. We're kind of used to technology either being this thing where it's ones or zeros. It's sort of yes or no, or when it's not yes or no, it's like, here's 10,000 nerd knobs we can give you to kind of tweak it to make you what you want. And we just haven't kind of figured out yet what the analogies are for those nerd knobs. Over time, I suspect we will figure out what those things are. I want to shift gears a little bit. A lot of folks who use Zapier today can build some fairly complex systems, can build complex workflows, things that are recursive and iterative and all sorts of things. Do you see there's a lot of discussions now starting to happen about, it's not just going to be, me prompting a system and getting a thing back and then prompting it again. It's sort of like, I want to build an agent or something acts on my behalf that will, go off and do some of these iterative loops and iterative learnings. Do you see Zapier as being kind of playing that role or kind of being in that space? Maybe you don't call it agents per se, but, something that says, hey, we can do these iterative loop based, kind of build upon each other types of workflows.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so last year we acquired a company called Vowel, whose team basically helped us accelerate the development of a tool that we just recently launched in preview called Central, which is an entirely agentic experience over automation workflows for Zapier.
Okay.
So and what that means is that essentially you could just describe what you want, right? You could say, hey, every time I get, invites to join a podcast, please go out and do some research on the host, their podcast, the target market, then, give me some summary of that overlaid with opportunities that are currently important to me based on this document. And, DM me in Slack if it's, or like draft a reply and put it in Gmail and then DM me in Slack when it's ready. And it'll just like, it runs that every time, not like in a very agent style, which means that it's using kind of its own, I think the other way that we often put it is like have AI guess. It's going to have AI guess where you want it to. And that's really cool. Yeah, we launched that in preview about 2 months ago now, maybe 3 months ago.
Okay.
And it's been really cool to see what folks are doing and how they're creating workflows there. We even just launched a Chrome extension where you can now use your agents and over like a web page as a like one-off type of flows. So it is cool to see what people are doing with these kind of more non-deterministic versus deterministic. And also for us, how do you reconcile those two is actually one of the most difficult challenges.
Yeah.
And for everybody listening and saying, what the hell is this guy talking about with deterministic, non-deterministic? That comes up a lot. I'll give you an example. A deterministic workflow would be you get an email, you want to send it to your sales team in Slack. You're going to map every field, right? You're going to say like, okay, the body of the email becomes the body of the Slack message. The title of the email becomes, I don't know, also in your Slack message. The channel is going to depend on who it came from, right? And you're going to you're going to do some logic there. It's like code, where non-deterministic is essentially you've given the agent some instruction that says, hey, I want this outcome of triaging these requests and fulfilling me with information. You have the capability to search Google, DM Slack, right? You figure out and think amongst yourselves, essentially, what the right next step is. And that's very cool. But that also breaks down. I want to be clear that's not just a either or. We've also been, and you can play around with this in Zapier, you can actually create deterministic flows with like non-deterministic single fields, which is a fascinating paradigm at the moment. Give you the same example for Slack, right? You might want to hard code, if you will, certain variables in that execution, but you might want to say, hey, the message that goes to that Slack channel eventually, that's the only thing I want you to guess. Every time this workflow runs, like based on all the data that you see in this thing and the instructions I previously gave you, figure out how to fill that in. And that it becomes pretty cool what you can start to do there. Customer comms, as an example, becomes really fascinating of being able to draft replies to customers and have like just that one field be what gets filled in by like an agent. Yeah. Kind of funky stuff there.
Yeah, it sounds it sounds a little bit like parenting teenagers, where it's like, I know what your schedule looks like, and I know roughly where you're going to be, but I can't read your mind about what you want to eat today, even though you've eaten the same thing for the last 6 days. So I'm going to let that part be guessed, but I'm going to, so a little different context.
Brian, I might steal that from you.
You're welcome. Always welcome to steal on this show. Always welcome to steal. Well, let me wrap up because I know you are a busy man and we appreciate the time. What are some of the best ways? I know there's a lot of new tools, a lot of new things that have been added to the platform. Like what are some of the best ways if people are listening to this and they go, whether they want to use it to help offload things that feel like busy work for them, or they're trying to take on something new that seems, big that AI could help with. Like, what are some of the best ways to get started, or what are some of the best resources that you typically will point people to kind of get successful early on?
Yeah. So first off, you can just go to zapier.com/AI. Sure. That's the easiest. For those that want a little bit more fun, I did build an automation consultant GPT. If you search in the GPT store, automation consultant, it actually leverages our natural language to workflow guesser type service. Okay. So you can actually use that to play around with. After that, connect with me on LinkedIn. I try to share a lot of tutorials and thoughts on kind of funky things that we're exploring with AI. So you can do that too. Okay. Not a big Twitter person anymore, but
yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, no, that's helpful. It's anything to help get rid of consultants is always a good thing too. So we like to hear that. No, this has been awesome. We could go into all sorts of detail, but like we mentioned, there's a ton of good stuff on the website that people can dig into. We put links to a bunch of things in the show notes. So if you're listening to this, dig into that. As I mentioned, you can always reach out to Reid and others on the team to help you get started. But thank you so much for this. Any places, I know we're sort of in various types of trade show seasons. Any good places if people are out at events or meetups or stuff to meet with the team?
I mean, for the folks and anybody in Vancouver, BC, I host a bit of a Vancouver AI community meetups there. But I'll be down at the AI Engineers World's Fair in San Francisco in June. So yeah, really looking forward to that. That's probably the main thing. Other than that, I'd say I actually ask people all the time, like, what events are you going to? Yeah. It becomes such a difficult thing to gauge.
Right. Yeah, people have different travel schedules and stuff. Well, cool. Well, listen, thank you so much for the time today. We really appreciate you both making the time for us, but also sharing some knowledge as well as kind of sharing how Zapier is going through both making the technology more usable, but also just kind of you guys' internal journey. I think that's as equally interesting because pretty much every company is going through the same sort of journey. So we appreciate that. And folks, with that, on behalf of Aaron and I, we want to thank Reid for his time. And we want to thank you all for listening. Thank you all for telling a friend, helping us grow the Cloudcast community, and giving us feedback in all the places that you listen to your podcasts and now on YouTube as well. So with that, we'll wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.